Good morning. Good morning, everyone. If I could have you take your seats, I think we'll get started. Thank you. My name is Carin Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at Sonoma State, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our Spring 2016 open house. I always like to start by asking how many people are here with us today for the first time, if you would raise your hand. Wonderful. I've asked returning students to tell their friends, and it looks like it's working. So thank you very much for joining us. We have truly composed a season, I think, that has something for everyone this spring, from astrobiology to Teddy Roosevelt to the history of rock and roll. So I think we have a lot of points of access to a wonderful roster of courses. I'm going to keep my comments a bit shorter today. We are going to go in the order of the catalog. With one scheduling request, we had to move one person to the beginning, and that request was from Charlene O'Rourke. Before we get started, let me tell you her story briefly. Charlene O'Rourke is a name that may not be familiar to you, even those of you who have taken her classes before. And this is because Charlene, her new last name, and her husband Jerry represent our latest OLLI couple, having married a few months ago in an intimate rainy beach ceremony, with one OLLI student presiding and another serving as both photographer and umbrella steward in the rain. This is just one example of the social and community threads that have come to define our OLLI program. And those of you who've been with us from the beginning know what I mean. Might I have those of you who have been with us from year one with OLLI, please raise your hand. We have a loyal student body in this program, and I'm grateful for every one of you for your continued participation. I just want to mention briefly that OLLI at Sonoma State represents the only place in the county where older adults can attend classes with college-level presentation and broad academic content while interacting with multiple generations as part of a university campus community. Research continues to show that lifelong learning is beneficial to both the body and the mind, even preventing cognitive decline as we age. And OLLI at Sonoma State now serves about 1,700 students a year who have discovered this magic formula of intellectual and social stimulation afforded by this program. As an impressive aside, the national network of Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes, which now numbers 119 on college campuses all over this country, is serving over 150,000 lifelong learners nationwide. For 15 years, OLLI at Sonoma State has been a leader in lifelong learning, setting the bar for other continuing education programs in the region and around the country. We are grateful to the Bernard Osher Foundation for their original grant to start this program, and to all of the volunteers and donors and students who have supported us over the years. It is because of you that OLLI continues to thrive. I would like also to thank Chris Alexander, our program assistant for OLLI, for all she does for the program and for her authenticity of spirit with our students and with me. It was perhaps in this spirit that she might have mentioned, as several of you have, that students actually come to these previews to hear the instructors and not to hear my voice. Although the free food doesn't hurt either. But to show what a good listener I can be, I will keep my remarks very short today, shorter than usual anyway, and introduce you to the 8 minds that will enlighten and entertain you in the weeks to come. Let me begin by introducing our newlywed, Charlene Lohmeyer.
so now I'm the blushing bride. I'm very grateful to Carin, and I'm hoping that I have my presentation coming up. Here we go. For the opportunity to repeat a course that I taught here 5 years ago. In the intervening time, I've been able to do a lot of research, and I've made a major upgrade to the program. So not only are you going to get those juicy stories about the scandalous Stuarts, but I can now walk you step by step through the political struggles that they had between the kings and queens and their parliaments, and show you how their issues are directly relevant to our political campaigns going on right this very minute. So the House of Stuart reigned over England, Scotland, and Ireland in the 1600s. This is the period when England is transitioning from medieval and inventing our modern world. It's directly relevant to us because it is people escaping from the conditions in Stuart England who were busy founding our country. The first 12 of our colonies occur under the Stuarts. They bring with them their culture, their political ideals, and their brand new view of the universe. This is one of the most turbulent centuries in English history. It has a protracted civil war. It has a bubonic plague of epidemic proportions, the largest ever in England, and at one point, London burns to the ground. The Stuart dynasty begins as the Tudor dynasty dies out, and the major rival of Queen Elizabeth was Mary, Queen of Scots. It is Mary's son who succeeds Elizabeth on the throne. He's been King of Scotland since he was 1 year old, and he's fairly bored with the daily business of being king, so he turns the running of his kingdoms over to a series of handsome young men who run the country during the day and warm the king's bed at night. His son is a contrast to him, so priggishly self-righteous and so insistent that everybody worship God exactly the way he does, that he ends up in a civil war with his own parliament, which he proceeds to lose, and they then execute him as a traitor to his own people. This leads to an attempt by Parliament to purify England of everything that's fun and to run the country without a king. It deteriorates into a military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. So when Cromwell dies, England is joyous at bringing the Playboy prince home and installing him as the merry monarch, known for the licentiousness of his court. This little boy is one of 14 illegitimate bastards that he acknowledged as his. But his queen was unable to bear children. So when he died, he passed the throne to his younger brother, who was every bit as randy, but not nearly as clever as Charles. Charles had managed to outwit his parliaments and retain all of his royal power, but James so infuriated his subjects by trying to turn England back into a Catholic country that they invited his daughter and her Dutch husband to invade, which they did in a bloodless coup, and kick James off the throne, installing William and Mary as joint rulers. William is spending every summer defending his native Netherlands from the attacks of Louis XIV, so he doesn't care what's going on in England, and he gives away to Parliament all of the powers that the previous Stuart kings have been trying to hang on to through the whole century. So it is because of William and Mary that we see the almost absolute power of Elizabeth II go into a constitutional monarchy, and every king and queen since William and Mary has been a mere figurehead. This leaves the final Stuart. The two, William and Mary, were first cousins, and that may be why they were never able to have a child. But the younger sister of Mary now becomes the queen. Her tragedy is that after 17 pregnancies, by the time she becomes queen, all of her children have died. So like the Tudor dynasty, which ended with a childless queen, so the Stuart dynasty. So I hope that you will come visit me and the soap opera lives of the kings and queens and see how their issues, especially religious freedom issues, are directly relevant to our politics today. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene. So we move now to the standard order in the catalog, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the interim dean of the School of Extended and International Education, Robert Eiler. And typically, I must say, there is a rule against paying deans to teach additional classes. And when Rob committed to teaching this class, he wasn't in the dean position. And then he was, and I said, you know, I can't pay you now. And he said, that's okay, I'll do it anyway. And so we're very grateful to have him here to offer his class and his time to an OLLI audience that he got familiar with, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 6 years ago, and he's back, and I know many of you are delighted to have him back, Dr. Robert Eiler.
Thanks, Carin. Let's see if I can, there you go. So thank you, and I want to thank everybody for coming today, and those of us that have taken classes before and who have given to the program, and I want to thank Carin and Chris for their dedication to you guys in this program. They've been great. So in somewhat contrast, I don't have that sexy a topic as the last one, but when you start talking about the international economy, basically, folks, if you take my class, it's going to be broken into 3 major sections. It's going to be trade, finance, and political arrangements. And we're going to spend most of our time on the first 2 because that's really where the juice is for me and also where a lot of the action happens. It really kind of bleeds into the third piece, which is the political arrangements. If it wasn't for trade and financial arrangements between countries, there'd be no reason to go into political arrangements. But as I'll talk to you about in a minute, since we're going into a major election cycle in the United States, and how many people in here subscribe to The Economist magazine, for example? Okay, good. How about the Wall Street Journal? How about the Financial Times? Okay, so one thing you may want to do just for fun is for 12 weeks, take advantage of some of the offers that are out there for major financial or political magazines that are worldwide in scope. A lot of the things I'm going to bring into class, and I'm going to try every single class to bring in something that has to do with the specific topic we're going to cover so that we can talk about it at the end. So the structure of my class is going to be, we're going to do about an hour worth of me, then we're going to do about a half an hour of a current topic, and then we're going to open it up for thoughts and discussion, because I want to hear about what you guys think about these world affairs too. I can tee it up, but in many ways, you all, how many people here have traveled, at least to 10 countries? Okay, so the cool thing is you're going to have some practical experience, probably some business experience, just to kind of see a different perspective than me, who's more of a theoretician, if you will, on these issues. So trade. One of the things, why do we have economic relationships? Well, we have economic relationships, folks, because we're people, and countries are made up of people. And when I teach this class to undergraduates or graduates, I talk about it as economies. Because countries, when they come together, like for example in the Euro area, they kind of lose some of their individual identity as countries, and they become an economy together. And when we talk about currency, when we trade, we don't really care where that country is per se, as long as we know what currency they're using, and that turns them into something different than their actual political borders. And it gets a little more messy in that sense. And it starts with trade. So one of the things, some basic questions to think about that I have up here. Why did manufacturing leave the US? Right? One of the things we lament is 20 years ago, we started to see an outpouring of manufacturing toward Southeast Asia and toward China. Why? We're going to talk about the why. We're also going to talk about why we buy so much from China. I remember when I was a kid, one of the things that came up was, that everything was getting made in China. All the toys I had were suddenly made in China, not in the United States anymore. Well, unbeknownst to me at 6 to 7 years old, there's some really strong economic reasons why that conversion took place. But then finally, and this is more of a fun thing, why do we buy so many bananas in the United States? Right? But there's fundamental economics behind the reason why we consume bananas at an unbelievable rate when we grow very few bananas here in the United States. Right? The coffee we drink generally comes from some other place. Why? Simple ideas, but have large, large effects in our lives. The next stop is finance, and this for a lot of you is probably the fun part, because the trade part you're kind of used to. You drink your coffee, you have your banana every morning, you don't really think about the fact it comes from places like Guatemala, from Sumatra and Indonesia. Who cares, right? It's here, and it's relatively inexpensive, which means I gave away about half that first class. But bottom line is the next stop is finance. So this is where you get financial markets and the use of currency coming together. And I usually tee up to undergraduates this idea is when you travel. You engage in international finance in two ways. You engage in it through a spot market. You pull your money out of the ATM when you land in London and you suddenly have pound sterling in front of you. Well, that also leads to a futures market choice. How much cash should you pull out? And are you suddenly then in an investment market? And the answer is yes. And the reason is why. Anybody want to take a chance in why, if you pull out too much money or you end up are you bringing home some pounds, what you suddenly have exposed yourself to? To risk, right? There's an exchange rate risk you've taken on because you basically invest in the pound when you travel in England. I'll talk more about that in the second class. But the bottom line is, why did the euro become the euro? One of the things we want to talk about as we slowly creep toward the political arrangements in this class, or why did those countries come together and why have they thought about kicking some out, like Greece, and why have they not let more countries in? Part of that is financial. The next thing, and this is a question I get all the time, will China ultimately bankrupt the US because they hold so much of our debt? Okay, I'm not going to tell you the answer to that yet, but in many ways, this is part of what we're going to talk about. The other thing we're going to talk about is so-called fixed versus floating currency arrangements. The beauty of being an economist, you can dichotomize almost everything in the world. So we're going to talk between spot and futures markets. We're going to talk between fixed and floating exchange rates. And we're going to talk about how they come together in interest rates. So the way in which currency trades itself in institutional trading is through an idea called interest rate parity theory. And it is the cornerstone of international finance. And it's a very simplistic financial equation that rules a lot of what happens around the world. And I'll talk about the importance of that. And this French word, just to keep it international, is a French word called arbitrage. Okay? Now, arbitrage is the rationale as to why the equation I'm going to show you is what it is. And we're always gravitating toward equilibrium. Again, a very kind of simple idea in economics, but that's all driven through incentives. So we're going to see that trade and financial relationships internationally are all incentive-based, and that also leads to political arrangements. You must have an incentive to come together with Canada, Mexico, the United States, Chile in this sort of broader relationship. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is about building incentives for nations to come together as a collective. And that's something that we talk about a lot in terms of an international scope. Why do we form currency unions? Why do we form customs unions? So what's really nice is once you cross into France, if you take the train into Italy, you don't have to necessarily go through a border check. Person walks on the train, they check and make sure your passport's valid, and you keep on your way. However, when you go into England and you take a plane to go into France, you might have your bag searched again. And the rules are changing all the time. One of the promises of the European Union is you would have free flow of labor across borders. And in many ways, it was the ascension of the old European market into a European Union. But that really is a so-called customs union. It's great, you can cross the border relatively fluidly, but we don't want your workers here. Okay? That's a big question because now we're seeing refugees coming from the Middle East into Europe, and it's changing the nature of the flow of the borders that are a political arrangement and whether or not we need to change that. So folks, there are headlines every day on this stuff, and that's what makes it so cool. And now this is kind of giving away the farm here too. On the last day, in like the last half an hour, I'm going to tell you as a wrap-up piece, it's just all supply and demand. Okay? Economic relationships internationally really just boil down to incentives and the way markets work. And it's very difficult to have markets work when political arrangements are not allowing it. And this is one of the things why we impose tariffs on each other, why we stop trade, but also why we open trade. So those are the tenets of my class. It's going to be Mondays at 9:30, I believe, starting April 4. So please come on, and I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Every once in a while, the economist throws the French lit major a bone and throws out a French word, I think just to make me feel better, but it is a French word. Thank you, Rob. All right, so we now move on to one of our favorite instructors who is so popular that her courses actually go longer than other courses. She needs time to both showcase her films and unpack them in her brilliant way for the OLLI audience, and I give you, with Screwball Comedies, Barbara Spear.
One more? Okay. Well, thank you, Carin, for your introduction, and thank you, students and friends, for your warm welcome. It's wonderful to be back at OLLI, new semester and a new course, Screwball, Hollywood's madcap romantic comedies. Well, what exactly does screwball mean? Of course, its original meaning, it's a baseball pitch designed to confuse the batter. Screwballs are like curveballs, but with reverse wrist action. And a screwball comedy is just as confusing and unexpected as its namesake. With screwball films, we enter a whole other world, a world of sleeping cars and porters, of starlit ocean liners and auto camps where almost no one can safely carry a tray. Inevitably, silverware and crockery will be spilled. Where books have titles such as Why Snakes Are Necessary, and even face-to-face conversations are confused because sometimes people, three or four people, are talking all at once at a very, very, very rapid rate. There can also be animals around and falling, a great deal of falling, over logs and feet and sofas and over ditches and into water, and most of all, falling into love. Well, screwball comedy is a uniquely American form that first appeared on screen in the 1930s. It was a product of different forces that affected the film industry and the nation. First and foremost, it was a product of the Great Depression and its effect on our class system. Suddenly, but also important, was the arrival of talking pictures in 1927. Suddenly, movie audiences were listening in on conversations they could only imagine during the era of silent films. And oh my, what those audiences were beginning to hear and see. Movies in the late 20s and early 30s became increasingly sexually explicit, both orally and visually. Hollywood itself was regarded as a hotbed of sin, sex, and insurrection. Then in 1934, the production code was put into effect, and suddenly movies became moral and pure, everything tied up with a neat bow at that happy ending. Well, it's no coincidence. 1934, the same year the production code went into effect, was also the first time there was a screwball comedy that was ever made. And that was Frank Capra's It Happened One Night, which set the pattern for screwballs. A female and a male who engaged in a battle of the sexes with the woman every bit the equal of the man. They're comedies of class, often classes in conflict, the rich versus the poor, but reverse class snobbery. The poor always know best, and the upper class just idle and pampered. And they like goats sometimes, too. Now, screwball comedy was a reaction then to the radical restrictions of the production code. It was like a breath of fresh air. It evolved because people in the United States society really needed to make sense of the financial realities of the time. They also needed to come to terms with changes that were taking place in social class and in men's and women's gender roles and behavior. Screwball comedy movies explore the confusion of life in America in the 1930s through gender and class role reversals, and they take the sexual tension that was forbidden by the production code and sublimate it into a slapstick comedy of antagonism between the man and the woman. But no matter the extent of the couple's differences, their love overcomes everything. In the end, we find a comforting truth that all of us, whatever we are, rich, poor, male, female, we're all only human. In this course, we'll see different screwball comedy each week and see firsthand how these movies take the conflicting cultural demands and weave them into a truly utopian conclusion. Now, during the grueling days of the Great Depression, the screwballs supplied a cultural escape valve for their audiences, who saw the rich being taught a lesson in humanity. Today, the films provide us with the period's most significant social commentary. Just maybe screwball comedies will give us a few ideas about how to bridge some of the divides that engulf our country today. I also want to bring a special focus in the course to the role of women in these films. The screwball female protagonist, whether it be Katharine Hepburn or Barbara Stanwyck or Carole Lombard, is self-confident, often stubborn. She dominates the relationship with the man. Sometimes their final romantic union is planned by the woman from the outset, and the poor guy doesn't know a thing about it. That's the case in Bringing Up Baby, one of the films we'll watch in class. Now, as Carin said, during this 6-week semester, we'll see a great movie each week, including The Philadelphia Story and The Lady Eve, and class will run longer than usual until 3:45 p.m., because every week a full-length feature film will be screened, and this will allow us to see the movies and have plenty of time to discuss their significance, too. Well, it occurred to me, maybe this course is a kind of antidote to the course I taught last spring. We certainly went through a lot of tissues watching those melodramas. Well, we won't need tissues this time around, though, unless it's to wipe away the tears of laughter. So I'm sure we'll have a fun time on Monday afternoons, and we'll all learn a lot from the films and from each other. I hope to see you then. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so from screwball to the Earth's climate history. We're looking at macro level issues now with our natural science, one of our 2 natural science instructors who is new to OLLI, one of our new instructors, I think 2 of you today, first timers. We're delighted to have him here. He'll also be teaching at Oakmont next year. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome from Silver Springs, Maryland, originally, or sort of here and then there and back again, Mr. Warren Wiscombe.
All right, my course is called The Goldilocks Planet, which I'll explain in a second. Earth's climate history. We're going to look at the entire history of the Earth's climate going back some 4 billion years and spend actually very little time on the current climate. The kinds of changes that have occurred in the Earth's climate over 4 billion years are much larger than we're experiencing now. And so as to my background, I should say that I worked at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center for 30 years. I spent most of my career working on climate. The last couple of years of my career, I actually got involved with the exoplanet research area, and so I'll have something to say about that as well. Why do we call it the Goldilocks Planet? Well, it's from the legend of the story of the Goldilocks and the 3 bears, right? One plate of porridge was too hot, one was just right, and one was too cold, and that's pretty much the case with our planets that are normally called our neighbors, Venus and Mars. Their average surface temperatures are -50 in the case of Mars, it's too cold, +15 centigrade in the case of Earth, it's just right, and +450 centigrade for Venus, way too hot, enough to melt lead and certainly to melt a human being. So I'll contrast the Earth with these 2 planets and then with a lot of the other new planets we've discovered in the last 10 to 20 years as well. The syllabus, very briefly, we'll start out by asking what is a climate system. It's a lot more than just the atmosphere. It includes 4 other spheres, but they're colloquially known as the ocean, which is the hydrosphere, the solid Earth, or the geosphere, the cryosphere, that's the ice part of the climate, sometimes here, mostly not in Earth's climate history, and then surprisingly the biosphere as well. We know that the biosphere provides oxygen for the Earth's atmosphere, but it has other relationships to the Earth's climate as well. And you may have heard of the Gaia hypothesis that the biosphere actually modulates Earth's climate beneficially and makes life on Earth possible, perhaps. So then we're going to look at climate models. These really started back in the 1890s when a scientist named Arrhenius built the first real climate model. But they more or less languished until the 1960s when the whole subject began again. And that was when I got into the subject in the early 1970s. Climate science was really just being born then. And climate was modeled in very simple ways in the 70s, in much more complicated ways nowadays, and we'll take a look at those things. And then we'll look at Earth's ancient climate and the question of how do we know anything at all about it. And so the ancient climate, this is one of the best things I've been able to find. Brown really means no ice on the Earth, and blue means ice. And you see, as we look back farther and farther in Earth's climate history, there's really less and less ice over the great extent of Earth's history, except for a period called Snowball Earth. The Earth has largely been nearly ice-free. So the current situation we're in, you see that second bar up, 1,000 years, is really rather unusual. And the blue period there is what's called the Little Ice Age, which we'll have something to say about. But the general run of Earth's climate outside of the last 3 million years or so has been largely ice-free. And we'll discuss why that is and how greenhouse gases have played a role in that. These are some of the tools that are used to understand past climate. They take ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica mainly, also in the tropical glaciers of Peru and elsewhere. And they carve them up wearing little bunny suits to avoid contamination, and then analyze the little slices of core to everything from the amount of carbon dioxide that was there to volcanic eruptions and various isotopes they look at. This is an ocean core off the Amazon River. You can see where in the top core you see a transition between brown mud and black mud, and that's a glacial, interglacial boundary. Ocean cores are important for understanding the climate. And then we'll focus down on the last 3 million years where we've been more or less descending into an ice age. There have been interglacials, but largely we've been an ice-dominated planet for the last, say, 2.5 million years anyway. And we'll discuss why that's happened and whether we're going to come out of it. You know, in spite of the current global warming, we may be destined for an icy future. Interaction of life and climate, I mentioned before, the Gaia hypothesis that life modulates climate for the better, and mass extinctions will be our final subject. We'll talk about how supervolcanoes and asteroids have inaugurated mass extinctions, and how all that plays with the Earth's climate. So one of the things we'll talk about is what do ice ages look like. During this last 3 million years, this was the ice at the peak of the last glacial period, or actually it was somewhat melting by that point, because you can see a pathway between the Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets where we think early humans migrated into the North American continent. So finally, I'm going to mention exoplanets near the end of the course and maybe weave it through the course as well. It's been a boon for artists who've drawn exoplanets that we can't see with our telescopes, since they're only a single pixel, if that. Many are deduced indirectly. But there are a lot of wonderful pictures of exoplanets, and what's come out is that there are many Earth-sized planets out there. This is a bar chart showing that the raw data from the Kepler mission, showing that there's, you know, at the point where this graph was made in November 2013, there were 674 Earth-sized planets. It quickly went up to over 700. And super Earth-sized planets up to twice the size of the Earth, 1,000. And when these numbers are corrected for biases, we actually find that there are a lot more Earth-sized planets than this bar chart would indicate. In fact, 1 billion Earth-sized planets in the Goldilocks zone, which is the zone, so-called habitable zone, around sun-like stars. So there's a lot of interesting things going out there in the galaxy that we're just beginning to learn about. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. little dubious about that exit, but I guess with the stairs we're good. Okay, so moving on to somebody who has taught in a number of venues. And when he told me he taught on cruise ships, I wasn't sure I could compete with that. But he has graced us with his presence again, stepping away from the cruise world and back onto the SSU campus, this time with his friend Teddy Roosevelt. I give you Mr. Bob Kirk.
Aha, there it is. Whoa, that worked pretty well. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming. This, I think, is my fourth or fifth course at Lifelong Learning here. So I'm very, very pleased to be back. And I'm pleased to be talking about one of my favorite characters, not only Teddy Roosevelt, but the time that he lived in, the first decade of the 20th century. A visitor recalled, after seeing Teddy Roosevelt, he said, you go into his presence, you feel his eyes upon you, you listen to his voice, and you go home and you wring his personality out of your clothes. So Teddy Roosevelt could actually carry my entire course, but I'm not going to put that burden on him. I'm going to talk about the entire decade and some of the things that went on during that time. Let me preface it by saying it was a decade of optimism. There had not been an important, really big war for 100 years, not since the time of Napoleon. There'd be no more wars, no more big wars. Spanish-American War, that wasn't much. But we were going to get over that. We were too intelligent for that. All kinds of new inventions, but the automobile, that's just a rich man's toy. It's probably impossible for man to fly, but gosh, the Wright brothers seem to have done that. We can now record voices and listen to music on demand on a phonograph, and we can look at flickering pictures on a screen in Nickelodeons and downtown storefronts. So everything's changing. My father was born in 1907 and died in 1997, and the changes that came about through his life, changes in almost all aspects of living in America, were phenomenal. So we'll look at the beginning of some of these things. And my PhD is in history, and I've been teaching history for about 4 decades, and I really enjoy doing it. And I've divided my course into 12 parts because we're going to have 6 sessions. We have 1 part before the break, 1 part after the break. And we're going to start off talking about the good old days, scenes from American life. What did Americans do back in the first decade? There were 76 million Americans, about twice the population of California today. And since then, we've grown 4.5 times to about 330 million people. About half the Americans lived on farms. The other half lived in communities of 2,500 or more. Men went to lodges, and when they didn't go to the lodge meeting, they were probably in the saloon. And women coped with keeping up with what women were supposed to be doing, which was taking care of the house and making themselves presentable and trying and finding out what did the new woman mean. So we'll talk about the growth of cities, a lot of interesting things going on during that period. Teddy Roosevelt himself grew up very rich family in New York City, but he was asthmatic as a child. His father had to carry him around at night because he had terrible coughing fits. And the father said, "T.D., I want you to build your body." And that's what they called him, T.D. And he built his body, so he became very vigorous and would yell, "Bully, bully," and charge up San Juan Hill, all that sort of thing. Probably our most vigorous, exciting president and the youngest president we've ever had. We'll see Teddy here in his cowboy outfit after his wife and his mother died on the same day. He bought a ranch out in the Dakotas and bought his cowboy outfit at Brooks Brothers, of course, and went out to the Dakotas and became a rancher. And all of that ended 128 years ago today, March the 14th, when they had the greatest blizzard in all of history, which killed most of his cattle. So he came back and re-entered politics and became Vice President of the United States, not as a promotion, but the boss in New York State, Boss Platt, couldn't kill Teddy. That'd be too obvious. He had to get rid of him somehow, so we'll make him vice president. We'll never hear from him again. We're going to and then, of course, McKinley was shot and Teddy became president. So Teddy and the new American empire coming out of the Spanish-American War, we took Cuba, we took Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and then Teddy's going to take the Canal Zone, but that's another story or two, which we'll get to in a moment. So we'll talk about this brief period of imperialism, which I think is pretty interesting. Then we'll talk about America's coming of age, all these things that were going on for the first time in our history. Instead of scooping out flour from a bin and putting it and weighing it, we would buy a package of gold medal flour, a brand name, sold coast to coast because we had this wonderful network of railroads, because we had the dawn of modern advertising, because we had national brands, big corporations startup, which we still have today, the biggest being the railroads, but other corporations which are still around today. And we have titans of industry, Carnegie and Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, and others, so we'll talk about them. We'll talk about the plight of the poor and how they form labor unions and try to get ahead. So lots and lots to talk about, much more than I'm mentioning here. Suddenly, Teddy becomes president in 1901 with the assassination of McKinley. He relishes the office. He loves what he's doing. He gets into trust busting, which means that he's going to start to break up some of the large corporations, such as Northern Securities Company, such as Standard Oil, and so forth and so on. He sets aside more land for national parks and national nature preserves of various kinds than all other presidents before him. And he sends the Great White Fleet around the world. Congress says we're not going to pay for that, but he wants to show American power. The fleet reaches Japan. He sends a message to Congress. Your fleet is in Japan. If you want it back, you'll appropriate the funds. This is the kind of man we're talking about. One of his sons said, my father wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. I just got back in January. I lectured for 16 days for Oceania cruises going through the Panama Canal. So I'm pretty much up on this. And I'm going to tell you how I think, smart train aside, I think this was the greatest achievement of the United States. Because not only did we have to engineer this thing, which the French absolutely failed at doing, and get the money to do it, and do the political part, which is to get the area from Colombia, but we had to solve the medical problem of yellow fever, which was a total mystery. We not only figured it out, but we solved the problem by getting rid of mosquitoes in probably the most pestilential place on the face of the earth, Panama. So losing relatively few lives and getting this canal built and opened by 1914. As Teddy Roosevelt said, I built the canal and I left Congress to debate, not the canal, but me. And it was something he wanted to do, and he had a great deal of willpower, and he did it. Big stick and Nobel Prize. He was the most war-loving person I can think of, aside from maybe Winston Churchill. He just got really excited about wars, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize, the first one. How in the world does that work? We're going to have a list among the handouts and in the talk of all the places that we invaded under Teddy Roosevelt. Invaded all over, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, all these places, and took away Panama from Colombia. But then he worked out a peace between Japan and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, got the Nobel Prize. We'll talk about the progressives, not only the muckrakers, but we'll just give you one example. That'd be Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. And the jungle was about the Chicago meatpacking industry. And it obviously needed a reform. So happened that Teddy at the time was eating his breakfast, and he was having sausages and eggs. He was reading The Jungle. He got to the part where they were making sausages, stepped into the rose garden, threw his plate out into the garden, inventing in one fell swoop not only the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, but the Frisbee as well. Lots of interesting people during this time. We're going to talk not only about the writer of The Wizard of Oz, which is really about the plight of the farmers in Kansas, but we're going to talk about people like Hetty Green, the richest woman in America, who had one dress because she was so frugal and had only the hem of it washed to save soap. And she wore her underwear until it wore out. Her son, and I'll tell you this again later, got gangrene in his leg because of a botched operation. She wouldn't pay for a doctor, and he lost his leg. But he inherited her money, so that worked out okay. We're going to talk about Stanford White, the architect, and how he was shot by Harry Thaw over the love for Evelyn Nesbit, what was she, kind of a pole dancer sort of person, and that was the great murder of the century until O.J. Simpson, at least. We're going to talk about immigration and its critics, these immigrants, the new immigration from Northern and Eastern Europe, and we're going to also talk about what to do about those. So they were cut off in 1924, and I'll tell you how. And I'll tell you how Teddy Roosevelt and the president of Stanford University, president of Columbia University, all kinds of people wanted to improve the race through eugenics, which would mean making it impossible for various people to procreate, the wrong people to procreate. And much of this was done, the very center of this thing was right here in Sonoma County at the state home at Eldridge, and we'll see how that worked. Final decade, Teddy says, this is my last chance to be a boy. I want to go down to the Amazon River, and he had a disastrous time down there, almost died. He also ran against his hand-picked successor, which was William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson in 1912. A man came out as he came out of a hotel in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I've actually been to that hotel and seen the plaque where it happened. Man came out and shot Teddy into the chest. It went through all of his notes, went through his eyeglass case. He went off and he gave a speech for 40 minutes with blood coming out of his shirt. It takes more than bullets to kill a bull moose. So we'll see his last decade. So this is Wednesday morning. It's a good place to be. We're going to have some pretty interesting stuff going on. And if Teddy were here, here's what he would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, moving on to something entirely different. This instructor came to me from OLLI at UC Berkeley, where he said that he was teaching a class on the history of rock and roll, and would Sonoma County be interested in something like that? And I said, well, I think we just might be. And so far, most of you wait until after this open house to register for your classes, but I will tell you that of the registrations that have come in to date, this class is by far leading the pack so far. So you wanted more contemporary issues, you wanted more arts, and from what I hear from Berkeley, this class was a tremendous asset to their roster, and I know it will be to ours. I give you our other new instructor, Pete Ellman, with the history of rock and roll.
Okay, great. musician has to move the microphone so he can be heard. Yeah, thank you for coming today. My name's Pete Ellman, and I'm teaching a class called Turn, 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 which is a different kind of history of rock and roll class, probably different than any you've ever heard of or seen. It's a regional and chronological road trip through the golden era of rock and roll, 1955 to 1970. And what does that mean? Well, regional in the chronological in the sense that we do it by period, regional in the sense that every week is like a different city, and I kind of stagger the classes so we're going kind of in chronological order, but we are taking a road trip from one city to another. A bit about myself, I'm a lifetime rock and roll musician. I play the piano, the guitar, the bass, a few other instruments. I sing, I write songs, I've produced a lot of records. I've worked all over the country as a studio musician, writer, performer. And I've also taught English and history. I don't know what happened to me a few years ago. I decided I wanted to get a credential because I love English and history, and I love Teddy Roosevelt, and I was just riveted to Bill's presentation. It was great. So it's kind of like Bob, not Bill, Bob's. So this class, it's a lot about history, but it's a lot about how rock and roll is intertwined with our culture. Many of the facts and stories about various artists that make up my classes are from primary sources, like my life. I've taught the class before, as Carin said, at Berkeley. It was really fun, and I found that this music touches a deep nerve in folks who grew up with these songs, like many of us in this room. And for me, it gives me a chance to do a few things I love, which is talk about rock and roll, play it, sing it, examine the history of this genre and some of the people who contributed to making it such an important part of our culture. And I get to interact with educated and interesting people who probably love this as much, if not more, than I do. So how is the class structured and what happens during the class? It's broken up chronologically into 6 different movements, each with its origin in a different region of America, and each session will include a few things. There'll be a background lecture where it's hopefully fast-moving and interesting and funny, and I tell some nice stories and talk about these artists and, you know, some biographical information. And I have a slideshow with photographs and some kind of silly, cute captions that help to explain what these people did and how they did it and where they came from and a little bit about their personalities. And I also will play, of course, CDs of some of their iconic songs and some that may be not so well known that are interesting. And I also have some selected film clips, videos of documentary films and some obscure archival clips that I've dug up that are really cool, that help us see these people kind of in their element. And there's a live music component. Maybe 3 or 4 times each class, I'll pick up a guitar or sit down at the piano and play and sing a tune that's like in that style, in that week that works, and people seem to like that a lot. Then, of course, we have a question and answer period where people get to reminisce and comment and critique and talk about, oh yeah, I was there when that happened and I saw that person. So I don't know if you all can see this, but this is just a basic, simple family tree of rock and roll. This is loosely kind of how I decided to come up with the class. So look, if you look at the top, 20th century American folk music, which is pretty much where all of our different kinds of music comes from. And I have 2 kind of different branches of that tree. One is Southern blues that goes down to electric R&B, New York R&B, New Orleans, Memphis, Brill Building, New York, Motown. And then on the right, you see hillbilly and country music, which gave way to rockabilly and Chuck Berry and rock and roll and folk rock and all that. And that's kind of like a nice way to look at how rock and roll kind of evolved in the 20th century. And, you know, we're going to talk a lot more about all these connections. And as you can see, there's some real connections between these different things. Now, that's not certainly every movement of music. So what cities and what movements will we cover? Well, real quick. Week 1, there's Chuck Berry, of course. Now, even though Chuck Berry grew up in Missouri and recorded in Chicago, the concentration and the focus of week 1 will be on New Orleans, because as many of you know, that's where the real rock and roll came from in the 50s, and the rhythm and blues, and people like Fats Domino and Little Richard and Specialty Records. And I also talk about some early stuff. You see underneath a picture of Chuck there, I wrote down Leadbelly, who was the king of the 12-string guitar, great American folk musician. Robert Johnson, the seminal blues guy. Alan Freed, who many of you know was a great DJ who kind of coined the phrase rock and roll in a sense. Little Richard, Bo Diddley. Chuck, of course, and Fats Domino. So the second week, we take a trip up the Mississippi River, of course, to Memphis. And there's a very young Elvis adjusting his cufflinks. The rockabilly era, R&B meets hillbilly music and country western, and the result is rock and roll. And I always love that quote. It's actually from Lee Von Helm, the late drummer for the band. He loved that phrase because that's kind of how I always saw rock and roll growing up too. So we spend a lot of time talking about other people besides Elvis, like Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran and all the great rockabilly artists. Then we go up week 3 to New York, the urbanization of rock and roll. And I guess, does anybody know who that is in that picture? That is, of course, that's Carole King, the great songwriter of the Brill Building. And we talk about the record men, the people who produced the records and started the labels like Jerry Wexler, and some of the tortured producers like Phil Spector and Bill Burns, Burt Burns. And we talk about some of the artists and the writers of the Brill Building and this really amazing connection between these young songwriters who are usually husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, and the record companies and the artists who did them. It's kind of a fascinating period. And then we keep moving into week 4, and we're doubling back to the city of Memphis, which is a very important city for this kind of music, and point south, 1963 to 68, raw sounds and soul music to the fore. And we talk about the origin of Stax Records and how they got to be what they were, which was the real crux of soul music in America in the 60s. And of course, this was happening during a very turbulent time in our country. So there was a lot of connections between the music that was coming out of the South and what was happening in the country politically and culturally and socially. So we talk about Booker T and the MGs, the great interracial house band of Memphis, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Dave, and James Brown. And we play some really, really interesting stuff, and I've got some great clips to show that week. We get to week 5. Of course, that's the Supremes' migration to Motown. Berry Gordy started this record company, and his music gets played probably even more today than it did in the 60s all over the world. And we call this the hallowed ground for American pop music. That's actually a phrase, comes from a song written by a friend of mine who's a record producer. And the song's called Hallowed Ground. And I think that's a great description to describe Motown and the studio there. The last week of this class is a special week. It's not necessarily a city, but it's definitely a chronological time period. It's Bob Dylan's 1965. Many of you may remember that's the year that Bob Dylan decided to, quote, go electric at the Newport Folk Festival. And he started playing with a group of fellows who became the band, Canadian musicians, plus a drummer from Arkansas, Lee Von Helm. And this is a really interesting week because we look at how Bob Dylan, who was really at the forefront of American music in terms of popularity, kind of made the transition defiantly and picked up that Fender Stratocaster and said, I'm going to play rock and roll and I don't care what you think, which is kind of what Bob Dylan always used to do. So basically, that's what happens in this class, and it's a lot of fun, and I hope to see a lot of you there. It's going to be Wednesdays, 1 to 3. It's going to be at the building down the road, the Cooperage, and I think it's going to be a really good experience for those of you who love rock and roll, and I also think it's going to be a good experience for people who maybe are kind of a little bit, see the mystery of rock and roll. Like what's this all about? Like, why was it so popular? How did it get so popular? What is it like to kind of be a rock and roll musician, and how does it work? So I think it'll be fun. Hope to see you then. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Something struck me while Pete was talking. A couple of years ago, you might remember that Mick Chantler did a course on baseball, but what he did was used baseball as a lens for looking at American history and culture, and it strikes me that Pete is doing the same thing with music, and I'm really excited to see how the class comes out. Thank you. So I bring you now to Carl Pilcher, who taught at Oakmont last term to great reviews and great acclaim. And he will be offering a course on life in the universe. So he's taking us even further afield than Goldilocks Planet and building on, in some ways, what Warren is doing, I suspect. And I welcome him to the stage now, Carl Pilcher. I think all of the scientists enter through the middle somehow.
Thanks very much, Carin. Okay, I thought I would start, first of all, I hear you all asking, so what is astrobiology? I'm going to answer that question, but I thought first I would tell you a little bit about my career, because I think in many ways my career embodies astrobiology. So I got really interested in chemistry when I was in high school, and took lots of chemistry, and then went to get a bachelor's degree in chemistry. And while I was getting my bachelor's degree, my old interest in science fiction and in space and in all of that kind of stuff came up. And I decided, wow, I'd really like to figure out a way to combine my background in chemistry with something in space science. So fortunately, I went off to a school to get my PhD where I could do that, and I came out with a PhD in chemistry, but a thesis that I had done in planetary astronomy, using telescopes. In fact, the very first telescope that I ever stood at with an eyepiece looking up at an object in the sky was the 200-inch on Mount Palomar, which at that time was the largest telescope in the world. So it was really kind of a thrilling transition. And then I went off and was a professor of astronomy at the University of Hawaii for about a dozen years. And I know what you're saying, it's tough work, but somebody's got to do that. While I was there, realized that I had a really abiding interest in government and in public policy and in international relations. And so being the perpetual student that I was, I decided, well, time to go off and get another degree. So I got a mid-career master's in international relations, with the intention of going to work in government, without the intention of going to work for NASA, however. But NASA made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, as they say, and I wound up working in the office that Sally Ride set up after the loss of the Challenger in 1986. And it was the Keep the Dream Alive office. It was the office to work at the interface between the human spaceflight program and the robotic science program, and keep the dream of humans going into space alive and make sure that science was an integral part of that dream. So that was kind of a thrilling transition, and I worked at NASA headquarters for a number of years. And then in 1996, something amazing happened. There was a press conference at NASA headquarters on August 7th, 1996, in which a group of scientists, some of whom worked at NASA, some of whom worked at Stanford, some of whom worked at McGill, said, we think we have found evidence of life in a meteorite from Mars, the famous Mars rock, ALH 84001, for those of you who are fond of the technical details. And I watched that press conference just enthralled. Unfortunately, at that point in my career, I had never taken a biology course. Somehow, I had escaped it in high school, I had escaped it in college, I had escaped it in graduate school. I thought, no way, this is way too much fun not to be a part of. So I became a fairly serious student of biology, and fortunately found some really good books that I could read, and I discovered that biology is really just really complicated chemistry. And then I found some really good microbiologists who helped me along. So I became a student of biology. I will remain one to the end of my days. And when the opportunity came to move from NASA headquarters to NASA Ames Research Center, which is down in Mountain View, and become the director of the NASA Astrobiology Institute, that was in 2006, I jumped at that opportunity. Absolutely the best job that I've ever had. I retired from it in 2013. In 2014, they asked me to come back and do it again, which is why I'm the interim director. I am trying really hard to retire again. I want to be a more successful retiree this time than I was last time. So now I took the time to tell you all that because astrobiology is the amalgam of all the fields that I've just mentioned and many, many more. So let me tell you a little bit about the course and what is astrobiology. The simplest way to describe what astrobiology is on this slide. It is the study of the potential of the universe to harbor life beyond Earth. So how do we go about evaluating that potential? Well, we have to start right here on Earth because Earth is the only planet on which we know for absolutely sure there is life. We can have a debate about intelligent life, particularly in light of the current presidential campaigns, but I'll try not to go there. So in week one, I'm going to give you an overview of the entire course. Basically, in week one, I'm going to tell you about what we're going to talk about in weeks 2 through 5. And then in weeks 2 through 5, and I'm going to do that for a particular reason. Astrobiology is the integration of all of these fields. It's the integration of the astronomical sciences, the biological sciences, the geological sciences, with chemistry and bits of philosophy and theology and ethics all thrown in together. And I think it's important to look at this really remarkable field in its totality once and get the overview, and then we'll go more deeply into particular things. So in week 2, we're going to be talking, and I'm going to try to use this pointer, but maybe not successfully. Does there happen to be a laser on this? There's supposed to be. Ah, we've got a laser. Great. Okay. Houston, we don't have a problem. So on week 2, we're going to talk about the nature of life on Earth, and we're going to talk about the origin of life on Earth. So, for example, we're going to talk about the things that are common to all life on Earth. This is a model of a protein, and we're going to talk about proteins and DNA and RNA and a molecule called ATP, which is the molecule that is providing the energy transport across all of our cells. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about not only the commonalities of life, but we're going to also talk about the diversity of life. We're going to talk about how life is able We're going to talk about how life is able to inhabit environments that we never thought were habitable, how life is able to exist on the sea floor, where we see some of the tube worms that are present at hydrothermal vents, and how life can exist in boiling sulfuric acid in hot springs in places such as Yellowstone National Park. And this is Grand Prismatic Spring from Yellowstone National Park. We're going to talk about the microbial life that exists in these environments, and we're going to talk about the tree of life. You may have learned in biology many years ago that the crown kingdoms on the tree of life are plants, animals, and fungi, and this is where the great diversity of life is represented. Well, what we're actually going to find is that the greatest diversity of life, the genetic and metabolic diversity of life, is all in the microbial world. And it is the microbial world that enables these environments that we thought were uninhabitable to be inhabited. So we're going to talk about all of that in week 2. In week 3, we're going to overlap most with Warren's course in that we're going to talk about the 4.5 billion year co-evolution of life and the Earth. What you're seeing right over here is a 3.5 billion year old rock formation from Western Australia. And these domes that you see right there are fossilized microbial structures. And we'll show you as well, I thought of putting them on this slide, but there wasn't the room, pictures of modern versions of these that also happen to exist in Western Australia and that are alive today. And we'll talk about how life and the planet have co-evolved over 4.5 billion years. With that understanding of how the one living planet that we can study in great detail has transitioned over its lifetime, we'll then take that knowledge and ask, how can we understand whether there ever was life on Mars? Mars was once a planet very different from the planet it is today. So we will spend week 4 talking about the exploration of Mars and looking at Mars as a habitable planet and seeing what we know about Mars' habitability and what we may be able to learn about whether or not Mars ever had life. From Mars, we'll move out into the outer solar system. This is Jupiter and the Galilean satellites. We'll learn that 3 of these moons, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, all have global oceans oceans underneath a frozen surface. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about Europa in particular, because that is a global water world in which the ocean is very close to the surface under just a few kilometers of ice. And there may even be material moving back and forth between that ocean and the surface. We'll also talk about moons of Saturn, which aren't on this slide. We'll talk about Titan, which actually has rain and rivers, except the rain isn't water. Does anybody know what the liquid in the rivers of Titan is and the lakes? It's methane. It's liquid methane and some liquid ethane. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about another moon of Saturn called Enceladus that has plumes of water and organic compounds and salts spewing out of its south pole. We'll talk about the global ocean that's under there and the potential for there to be life on that moon and other moons in the outer solar system. And then finally, overlapping with Warren again, in week 6, we'll move out to planets around other stars, and we'll ask what is the potential for habitable planets and life itself on planets around other stars, and if there are habitable planets, and if there is life, how could we tell? And so we'll have a lot of fun. We will paint a picture of life as a cosmic phenomenon, and I hope you will come join me on that exciting journey.
Thank you, Carl. I will say that when Carl presented this class at the Oakmont Open House last term, we had a lot of people saying, "Oh God, I don't know science, that's just too much." And they signed up for the class anyway because of that presentation. And there were over 100 people in the room, and they loved it. So whether you're a scientist or not, you're in for a treat. We end with somebody who is on the faculty here at Sonoma State University who taught a class for OLLI a few years back on Muhammad Ali and the civil rights movement, and he's now taking the concept of racism into the current moment with understanding how racism works today. I give you Mike Ezra.
Hi, everybody. I don't think I need the microphone. And by the way, Long Island, New York, if you were wondering. That's the first question many people ask me. So I was thinking about how to put together, it says in the email attachment I got, expected that all faculty attend the preview to present a 5-minute talk about that course. Combining your talk with a PowerPoint presentation, oh man. I've never done PowerPoint in my life, so I've got no PowerPoint presentation for you, but we can look at astrobiology in the meantime. But I was wondering, this is a preview, how to sell this course basically in preview form. And I was thinking about like movie previews. That's when I usually think of a preview, a movie preview. You know, what does a movie preview consist of? So I don't know how to do PowerPoint, so I thought, you know what, I'll just brag to you about my accomplishments, books and stuff. And so I sent links to my various publications to OLLI, and they sent it back to me and said, we're not putting that up on the screen. No one wants to hear about your books. And I guess that's like a movie director talking about previous movies and Academy Awards they've won and stuff while trying to sell a movie, so that wouldn't work. And then I see people are giving kind of an overview of their course, but you know, you don't see that in movie previews. You don't see in scene 1 the protagonist. So I figured, all right, let's not do that. So why don't I just like teach my course to you for 2 minutes? They never do that in a movie preview where they just roll the film for a minute. Let me roll the film. Now, raise your hand if you believe that racism exists in the United States and can be a significant force in people's lives. Right. Okay. Most everyone thinks racism. Raise your hand if you believe you are a racist. There you go. That's how racism works in America. I mean, like, look, nobody in here is a white supremacist. No one in here is a neo-Nazi. And yet here we are, basically in an all-white setting. There's a few people of Asian descent here. No African Americans, I can tell. I'm not sure if there's other people of Latino descent. It's not like it's voluntary self-selection to go into a mostly white or all-white group here. But that's what's turned out. That's the common sense in America. There's racism, but I'm not a racist. but it really depends on your definition of racism. If you define racism as a hater or an overt white supremacist, then nobody in this room probably is a racist. But that's one of the ways how racism works in the United States. People define racism as hate, which it is not. It is not about hate. One of the catchphrases in the course, it ain't about hate. And therefore think that the problem is not really ours to solve. I mean, we're not racist, we know it's wrong, we're not participating in it. Therefore, it's somebody else's problem. Like I'll ask you, raise your hand if you think racism is cool. No. Or racism is good. Or I want to hang out with the racists. They have the best parties, the best music, the best clothes. No. I mean, it's been taught in schools for generations now that hate is wrong. We know that already. So here we are, arguably one of the most innovative and influential societies in world history, where for generations, the people who will run the country one day, the college graduates and such, have all said racism sucks, we don't like it, we repudiate it, but everyone also says it's still here. So how come we haven't been able to get rid of this thing that we, pretty influential people, want to get rid of? How does that work in America? How has it fallen out of the hands of the individual in many ways? And yes, obviously we can look at the political situation right now and we can see that hate is important to some people, and some people are haters. But more people think it's wrong. So I don't think hate's the reason why racism exists exactly. One of the major reasons I think racism persists is the way we are trained to define it. We define racism as individual acts of aggression, now called microaggressions, which certainly do exist and can wreak havoc on certain people's lives. But that's not entirely what racism exists of. If you define racist as hater or white supremacist, then nobody in the room is a racist. But that's really an outdated definition that so many of us use. How can we really blame the haters for the racism that exists today? Up until now, I mean, for about 50 years, it's been verboten in American politics to run on a platform of racism. You can code your racism, but you can't preach hate until now. And we'll see the outcome. I mean, that hasn't necessarily been a winning formula. We'll see how it all turns out. But for years, that has been kind of banished from the political scene. You can't do that. So how can we really blame the haters for the racism that exists today? They are not the ones in control. The haters are a minimal problem, I can argue. Well, then how come racism still exists? How come we define it the way we do? I define racism in a different way than hate. And in this class, I'll try to unpack the ways racism really works in this country. Racism is, by definition in this class, a racial imbalance of political or economic power. A predictable, durable, historical imbalance of political or economic power. That's basically what it is. Most racism in the United States is built into our political and economic structure. It is not about how people treat each other on the individual level. It has very little to do with hate. It is almost completely out of the hands of the individual, but not out of the hands of the collective. So what are the ways how racism exists today, and what will I do in the 6 weeks? Well, I have 6 main ways how racism works. Each class will unpack one of those ways. One way is the standards of beauty in America, what is defined as beautiful and what's not. Another way is how history is told, remembered, taught, and written, the history curricula of our schools. A third is anti-black propaganda in popular culture. It's coded. Very rarely will you hear characters in movies and such use ethnic slurs, and they'll be identified as bad people. But trust me, the anti-black message runs deep in our popular culture, and I'll try to show you some subtle ways it works. Fourth, housing inequalities and how public space is divided. Fifth, educational inequalities. And lastly, anti-black violence against African Americans has been employed throughout the years. There's also something I won't get into in the class as much because we don't have a 7th week, but if I did have a 7th week, I'd talk about the war on drugs and the criminal justice system. Those are the ways in which racism exists in our society. And politically, they can be challenged by a collective, but first we have to be able to identify the target. And I think by identifying the target as haters, I think we're falling into that trap again in the election. We're really missing the mark in a lot of ways. I'll even name a name, fine. Trump is not really the face of American racism, although it appears that way to many people who consume the news media. It is much more ingrained in the political system than that. There are many more candidates in the field right now who use racism as the building block of their campaign. It's just not as overt as we've seen for the Trump campaign. So there it is.
Thank you, Mike. All right, so you have heard all of our 8 instructors. I just want to close by mentioning again that this is the end or the last term, really, of our 15th year of OLLI on this campus. It has been a remarkable year. It has been a year in which we have looked at the idea of the good life and the role that lifelong learning plays in your collective good life on this campus and in the county. And I'd like to just give you a quick preview of what's happening this summer, which will be truly the end of our 15th year. We're putting together something we're calling the OLLI Summer Sampler. Most of you know that our courses fall into 6 major subject areas, and those are the arts, contemporary issues, food and wine, social and political history, natural sciences, and world cultures. So we have picked some of our best and brightest instructors, one from each of those subject areas, who will be offering a course every Tuesday morning between mid-June and the end of July in the new Student Center. And you will be getting a whole list of who's doing what when, but this is just by way of preview. And it's a wonderful way for existing and new OLLI students to get a sampling of what we do here at Sonoma State. So keep your eye on the Gray Matters newsletter for particulars on the OLLI Summer Sampler, and help us close out what has been a marvelous 15th year here at SSU. I invite you all to meet the instructors one-on-one in the lobby. They'll be spending a little bit more time there before we drag them off to a faculty lunch and give them some free food. And I hope to get to know many more of you over the course of the next term and into the summer and into next year. Bring your friends, help us celebrate OLLI at Sonoma State. Thank you so much for coming.